In the cold, echoing halls of Madrid's Alcazar Palace, on a bleak November day in 1700, a king lay dead, a man whose body had long been a battleground of ailments, whose reign had been a desperate struggle against his own frail flesh. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg dynasty, was no ordinary monarch. His death at the tender age of 38 was not just the end of a life, but the collapse of an empire teetering on the edge of ruin. When physicians and priests gathered to perform his autopsy, they uncovered secrets so grotesque, so unthinkable, that whispers of horror spread like wildfire across Europe. What they found inside the king's body was not merely the decay of a man, but a chilling testament to centuries of royal ambition, inbreeding, and the dark cost of power. This is the story of Charles II, a ruler whose very existence defied nature, and whose autopsy revealed truths that shocked the world. To understand the tragedy of Charles II, we must step back into the tangled web of 17th century Europe, a continent carved up by dynastic rivalries and unrelenting wars. Spain, once the mightiest empire on earth, was a fading giant by the time Charles was born in 1661. The Habsburgs, who had ruled Spain since the 16th century, were a family obsessed with preserving their bloodline, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, in a relentless quest to keep power within their grasp. This practice, while politically strategic, came at a devastating human cost. Charles II was the product of generations of such union-shiz parents. Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria were uncle and niece. The result was a genetic lottery that left Charles with a host of physical and mental afflictions, earning him the tragic nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, as many believed his condition could only be the work of dark magic or divine curse. Charles's early life was marked by fragility. Born with a deformed jaw so severe he could barely chew, a tongue too large for his mouth, and a body that seemed to age prematurely, he was a child who inspired pity rather than awe. His Habsburg lineage was evident in his protruding lower lip and elongated face, traits exaggerated to a grotesque degree through inbreeding. He did not walk until he was nearly 6, and his speech remained slurred and halting throughout his life. Yet, despite these challenges, Charles was the heir to an empire that spanned from the Americas to the Philippines, a burden far too heavy for his weakened shoulders. His mother, Mariana, ruled as regent during his minority, while court factions and foreign powers schemed to control the vulnerable king. Spain's treasury was depleted by endless conflicts, including the 30 Years' War and struggles against France, and the once mighty nation was a shadow of its former self. Charles, though king in name, was often a pawn in the hands of advisors. His court a nest of intrigue, where loyalty was a rare commodity. Beyond his personal frailties, Charles's reign was overshadowed by a looming crisis. He had no heir. Married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, both unions failed to produce children, a failure that fueled rumors of impotence and further cemented the belief that he was cursed. The question of succession became a European obsession, as France, Austria, and other powers vied to place their own candidates on the Spanish throne. The stakes could not have been higher. Whoever controlled Spain would inherit its vast colonial wealth and strategic territories. Charles, aware of his deteriorating health, was tormented by the knowledge that his death would likely plunge Europe into war. His body, already a prison of pain, became a symbol of a dying dynasty, each ailment a reminder of the Habsburgs' fatal obsession with purity. As the years dragged on, Charles's condition worsened. He suffered from seizures, fevers, and a host of mysterious illnesses that baffled the best physicians of the age. Some attributed his suffering to poison or witchcraft, while others whispered that his bloodline was simply too corrupted to sustain life. By the late 1690s, he was a skeletal figure, barely able to stand, his mind clouded by pain and despair. When he finally succumbed on the 1st of November, 1,700. After days of agony, there was a collective sigh of relief and dread. The king was dead, but what lay inside him? What secrets did his tortured body hold? The autopsy that followed, ordered to determine the cause of death and perhaps to dispel rumors of foul play, would reveal horrors that no one could have anticipated. It was a moment that would not only mark the end of Charles II, but would expose the dark underbelly of royal ambition, leaving Europe reeling in shock and fascination. As Charles II languished in the gilded cage of the Alcazar Palace, his reign became a battlefield of whispers, schemes, and desperate power plays. The Spanish court, once a bastion of imperial might, had transformed into a viper's nest by the 1680s, where loyalty was a currency few could afford. The king, weakened by his myriad ailments and often confined to his bed, was a spectral figurehead, his authority undermined by those who claimed to serve him. Factions within the court, nobles, clergy, and foreign ambassadors jockeyed for influence, each with their own vision for Spain's future. The central issue gnawing at the heart of the empire was the question of succession. With no heir to call his own, Charles's death promised a power vacuum that could ignite a continent-wide war, and everyone knew it. The tension was palpable, a storm brewing not just over Spain, but over all of Europe, as rival powers circled like vultures over a dying beast. The two most powerful contenders for influence over Charles were his mother, Mariana of Austria, and his second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg. Mariana, who had served as regent during Charles's childhood, clung to power even after her son reached adulthood, her iron will shaping much of the court's early decisions. Her pro-Austrian leanings, rooted in her Habsburg heritage, put her at odds with those who favored closer ties to France. Maria Anna, married to Charles in 1690 after the death of his first wife, brought her own ambitions to the table. A German princess with ties to the Holy Roman Empire, she was determined to secure the succession for her family's interests, even as her marriage to Charles remained childless. The two women despised each other, their rivalry playing out in whispered campaigns and public slights, each accusing the other of manipulating the king's fragile mind. Charles, caught between them, was often too ill or despondent to assert control, his decisions swayed by whoever had his ear on a given day. This domestic discord only deepened the chaos, as courtiers aligned themselves with one queen or the other, turning the palace into a chessboard of intrigue. Beyond the court, foreign powers tightened their grip on Spain's future. France, under the ambitious Louis XIV, saw an opportunity to claim the Spanish throne for a Bourbon candidate, leveraging the marriage of Charles's first wife, Marie-Louise, who had been a French princess. Louis argued that his grandson, Philip of Anjou, had a legitimate claim through familial ties, and he was prepared to back it with military might, if necessary. Meanwhile, the Austrian Habsburgs, led by Emperor Leopold I, insisted that the throne should remain within their dynasty, proposing Archduke Charles as the rightful heir. England and the Dutch Republic, wary of either France or Austria gaining too much power, formed alliances to counterbalance the giants, their diplomats weaving a web of treaties and promises. Every letter, every envoy sent to Madrid, carried the weight of potential war, and Charles, painfully aware of the stakes, was tormented by indecision. His health, already a crumbling foundation, deteriorated further under the strain, his body racked by fevers and convulsions as if mirroring the turmoil of his kingdom. Adding to the political maelstrom were the persistent rumors of supernatural interference. Many in Spain, from peasants to priests, believed Charles's afflictions and childlessness were the result of a curse or witchcraft. Exorcisms were performed at the king's bedside, incense and prayers filling the air as holy men sought to banish the demons supposedly plaguing him. Some pointed fingers at his wives, accusing them of dark arts when pregnancies failed to materialize. These superstitions, while dismissed by the more enlightened minds of the court, fueled public unrest and gave ammunition to those who sought to discredit Charles's rule. The king himself, raised in a deeply religious environment, was not immune to such fears, reportedly clutching rosaries and relics in his final years, begging for divine mercy. This blend of political scheming and spiritual dread created an atmosphere of paranoia, where every shadow hid a traitor, and every illness was a sign of doom. By the late 1690s, the conflict had reached a fever pitch. Charles's health was in free fall, his body a mere husk of the man he might have been, and yet the pressure on him to name a successor grew unbearable. Ambassadors from France and Austria haunted the palace corridors, their demands cloaked in flattery, while his advisors argued bitterly over which path would save Spain from ruin. The king's signature on a will became the most coveted prize in Europe, a document that could redraw the map of power. As Charles lay dying, the weight of an empire crushed what little strength he had left, his every breath a countdown to chaos. The stage was set for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, one that would culminate not just in his death, but in revelations so shocking they would echo through history. By the closing years of the 17th century, Charles II of Spain was a living ghost, his body a crumbling relic of a once mighty dynasty. The Alcazar Palace, with its opulent halls and somber shadows, had become his prison, a place where the air was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and the murmur of desperate prayers. The king, now in his late 30s, was a man out of time, his skeletal frame hunched under the weight of velvet robes, his eyes sunken with pain and resignation. Each day was a battle against a litany of ailments that seemed to multiply with cruel precision, as if nature itself conspired to erase the last vestiges of Habsburg glory from his blood. His decline was not just a personal tragedy, but a public spectacle, watched with bated breath by a court that both pitied and exploited him, and by a continent poised for the chaos his death would unleash. Charles's physical suffering was relentless, a catalogue of horrors that left even the most hardened physicians of the era recoiling in dismay. His deformed jaw, a hallmark of Habsburg inbreeding, made eating a torturous ordeal. Food had to be mashed into a pulp, and even then, he often choked, his oversized tongue struggling to form words or swallow. Drooling was a constant humiliation, one that stripped him of the dignity a king should command. His legs, weakened from childhood, could barely support his weight, and he relied on canes or attendants to shuffle through the palace, each step a grimace of agony. Seizures struck without warning, sending him convulsing to the floor, while fevers burned through him, leaving his skin clammy and his mind fogged. His digestive system was a wreck, plagued by chronic diarrhea and abdominal pain, and his vision dimmed as cataracts clouded his eyes. These were not the ailments of old age, but the premature decay of a body betrayed by its own lineage, a genetic prison from which there was no escape. Mentally, Charles was equally besieged. Though not as intellectually impaired as some cruel rumors suggested, his mind was often clouded by pain and the heavy sedatives administered by his doctors. Depression gripped him, a dark companion in his lonely hours, as he grappled with the knowledge that he was the last of his line, a king who could neither rule effectively nor produce an heir. The weight of Spain's decline mirrored his own. He saw in every report of lost territories or empty coffers a reflection of his own inadequacy. Courtiers noted his increasing withdrawal, how he would sit for hours staring at religious icons, muttering prayers for salvation, haunted by the belief that his suffering was divine punishment for the sins of his ancestors. The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, clung to him like a shroud, and though he outwardly rejected notions of witchcraft, the fear of a curse gnawed at his soul. Fed by the exorcisms and rituals forced upon him by zealous priests, the medical treatments of the time, far from offering relief, often deepened his torment. Physicians, operating under the misguided theories of humoral imbalance, subjected Charles to brutal regimens of bloodletting, purging, and blistering, draining what little strength he had in the name of healing. Concoctions of mercury and other toxic substances were forced down his throat, meant to cleanse his body but instead poisoning him further, likely exacerbating his neurological symptoms. Charlatans and alchemists, summoned by desperate advisors, offered elixirs and amulets, their promises of miracles as empty as the king's treasury. One particularly harrowing account describes how hot irons were applied to his skin to draw out evil humors, leaving burns that festered for weeks. These interventions, combined with a diet unfit for his fragile constitution, turned his body into a battlefield, each supposed cure a new form of torture. The palace became a theater of suffering, where the king's groans echoed through stone corridors, a grim soundtrack to a dying reign. As Charles's health plummeted, the political vultures tightened their circle. His bedchamber was no longer a sanctuary but a stage for whispered conspiracies, where ambassadors and nobles pressed him to sign a will that would favor their cause. His second wife, Maria Anna, hovered constantly, her concern tinged with ambition. While letters from foreign courts arrived daily, their polite inquiries barely masking their urgency. Charles, in rare moments of clarity, understood the Statius death would not be a quiet passing but the spark of a war that could engulf Europe. Yet trapped in a body that refused to obey him, he could do little but endure, his spirit as imprisoned as his flesh. By the autumn of 1700, as his organs began to fail and his breath grew shallow, the end was near. But the true horror was yet to come. What lay hidden within him, beneath the scars of a tortured life, would soon be revealed in a way that no one, not even his closest confidants, could have foreseen. In the waning days of October 1700, the Alcazar Palace in Madrid was cloaked in an oppressive silence, broken only by the labored breathing of a dying king. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of a fading empire, lay in his canopied bed, his emaciated body barely a shadow beneath the heavy brocade covers. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the bitter tang of medicinal draughts, while flickering candlelight cast ghostly shapes on the walls, as if death itself danced in the shadows. At 38 years old, Charles had endured a lifetime of suffering, his body a broken vessel for a dynasty's ambitions. But now the end was undeniable. Physicians, priests, and courtiers gathered like mourners at a funeral not yet begun, their faces a mix of dread and anticipation, knowing that the king's final breath would unleash a storm across Europe. This was no quiet passing. It was the shattering of an era, a moment of profound tragedy that would soon give way to horror. Charles's final days were a descent into unrelenting agony. His body, already ravaged by decades of genetic afflictions and brutal treatments, began to shut down with merciless finality. His kidneys failed, causing his limbs to swell grotesquely, while his lungs struggled to draw air, each gasp a wet, rattling plea for relief. Fever consumed him, his skin burning to the touch, yet he shivered uncontrollably, wrapped in furs that offered no comfort. His mind, once capable of fleeting clarity, now drifted in a haze of delirium, haunted by visions of his ancestors and the weight of an empire he could not save. He clutched a crucifix with trembling hands, his lips moving in silent prayer, begging for forgiveness or perhaps an end to the torment that had defined his existence. Attendants wept openly, not just for their king, but for the uncertainty his death heralded, while others watched with cold calculation, their thoughts already on the succession. On the 29th of October, 1700, Charles received the last rites, his confessor leaning close to hear the faint whispers of a man too weak to speak above a murmur. The sacrament was a somber affair, the weight of finality pressing down on the room as holy oil was anointed on his forehead, hands, and feet. Even in these sacred moments, politics intruded. Advisors hovered nearby, urging him to confirm his will, a document that had been the subject of bitter contention for months. Just days earlier, under immense pressure and in a state of near collapse, Charles had named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. a decision that favored the Bourbon claim over the Austrian Habsburgs. It was a choice born of exhaustion as much as conviction, one that would later ignite the War of the Spanish Succession. But in that moment, it was the final act of a king who longed only for peace. His signature, scrawled with a shaking hand, was the last exertion of his will, a trembling line that would redraw the map of power. As the night of the 1st of November, 1700, deepened, Charles's struggle reached its end. His breathing grew shallower, each inhale a battle lost, until, surrounded by a small circle of tearful attendants and stone-faced nobles, he exhaled one last time. The king was dead. A profound stillness settled over the palace, as if the world itself held its breath. Bells tolled across Madrid, their mournful peals carrying the news to a city already steeped in grief and fear. In the royal chamber, the body of Charles II lay pale and still, his face finally free of pain, yet eerily distorted by the deformities that had marked his life. His death was not just the loss of a man, but the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. The Habsburg line, so fiercely guarded through generations of inbreeding, had extinguished itself in this frail, tragic figure. Yet, even as the court began preparations for a state funeral, a darker task loomed. The question of what had killed Charles II lingered like a specter, fueled by years of rumor poison, witchcraft, or simply the curse of his bloodline. To silence speculation and confirm the cause of death, an autopsy was ordered, a grim necessity in an age where royal deaths often carried whispers of foul play. Physicians and officials gathered, their instruments gleaming under candlelight, as the body of the king was laid bare on a cold stone slab. What they expected to find was evidence of disease, perhaps the toll of his known ailments, but what they uncovered was far beyond imagination. As the first incisions were made, gasps echoed through the chamber, for inside Charles II lay revelations so grotesque, so unnatural, that they would send shockwaves through the courts of Europe. The true horror of his life, hidden beneath his skin, was about to be exposed, a final, macabre chapter in the story of a king who had never truly lived. In the dim, cavernous underbelly of the Alcazar Palace, on a cold November day in 1700, a small group of physicians, royal officials, and clergy stood over the lifeless body of Charles II of Spain. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the faint decay of death, as flickering torches cast long shadows across the stone chamber. The autopsy, ordered to determine the cause of the king's demise and to quell rampant rumors of poison or witchcraft, was meant to be a routine, if grim, procedure. But as the surgeon's blades cut through the pale, emaciated flesh of the last Habsburg king, what they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying, grotesque tableau of human ruin that defied medical understanding and sent a shudder through even the most stoic observers. The secrets held within Charles's body were not just the end of his tragic story. They were a damning indictment of a dynasty's obsession with blood purity, a revelation that would echo through the courts of Europe with a mix of revulsion and fascination. The findings of the autopsy, recorded in chilling detail by those present, painted a picture of a body so ravaged by genetic defects and disease that it seemed almost inhuman. Charles's internal organs were a catalog of abnormalities. His heart was described as unusually small, the size of a peppercorn, and discolored, barely capable of sustaining life in his final years. His lungs were blackened and filled with fluid, evidence of chronic infections that had likely contributed to his labored breathing. His liver was shriveled and scarred, his kidneys malformed and barely functional, explaining the painful swelling and systemic failures that plagued him. Most shocking of all was the state of his reproductive system. His testes were atrophied, and there were signs of severe hormonal imbalances, confirming the long-whispered suspicions of infertility that had haunted his reign. His brain, too, showed signs of damage, with fluid accumulation suggesting hydrocephalus, a condition that could account for his seizures and mental fog. These were not the marks of a single illness, but the cumulative toll of generations of inbreeding, a genetic collapse that had turned the king's body into a living nightmare. Beyond the physical devastation, the autopsy report noted details that fueled the already rampant superstitions of the age. Some accounts, though likely exaggerated by sensationalism, claimed that Charles's blood was unnaturally dark and thick, almost as if corrupted, while others whispered that his intestines were twisted in ways that seemed demonic. Though such descriptions were colored by the era's limited scientific understanding and penchant for the supernatural, they reflected the sheer horror felt by those who witnessed the dissection. The physicians, trained in the rudimentary medicine of the 17th century, could offer no clear explanation beyond the obvious. Charles II had been doomed from birth, his body a tragic experiment in the limits of human endurance. The report, meant to be a confidential record, quickly leaked, its gruesome details spreading like wildfire through Madrid and beyond, carried by couriers and gossip to every corner of Europe. The king's death was no longer just a political event. It was a macabre spectacle, a cautionary tale of royal hubris. The immediate aftermath of Charles's death and the autopsy revelations plunged Spain into mourning and uncertainty. His body, once the vessel of an empire, was prepared for burial with all the pomp befitting a king, laid to rest in the royal crypt of El Escorial, even as whispers of his cursed condition tainted the solemnity. The court, already fractured by years of intrigue, descended into chaos as the succession crisis erupted in full force. Charles's will, naming Philip of Anjou as heir, was contested by the Austrian Habsburgs, and within months, the War of the Spanish Succession would engulf the continent, a brutal conflict that would rage for over a decade. The autopsy findings, though not directly tied to the war, added a layer of morbid fascination to the political drama, as rival powers used the story of Charles's ruined body to argue the degeneracy of the Habsburg line or the divine disapproval of their rule. In France, propagandists spun tales of the monster king to bolster Bourbon claims, while in Austria, there was a quiet shame, a recognition that their family's practices had contributed to this tragedy. Across Europe, the news of Charles's autopsy sparked a mix of scientific curiosity and moral outrage. Physicians and scholars began to question the consequences of consanguineous marriages, though it would be centuries before genetics provided a full explanation. Among the common people, the story took on a life of its own, becoming a grim fable of the price of power, a king whose body was as broken as the empire he inherited. In Spain, grief for Charles was tinged with a sense of relief that his suffering was over, and perhaps that the Habsburg line, with all its flaws, had finally ended. Yet, the shadow of his death lingered, a reminder of a past that could not be undone, and a future that was already stained with blood. The autopsy had not just revealed the cause of a king's death, it had exposed the dark heart of a dynasty, leaving an indelible mark on history. The death of Charles II of Spain in November 1700, and the shocking revelations of his autopsy, marked more than the end of a single life. It was the final curtain on a dynasty that had shaped the course of European history for nearly 2 centuries. The Habsburg line, once a symbol of unassailable power, had crumbled under the weight of its own ambitions, its obsession with blood purity, leaving behind a tragic figure whose body became a grim testament to the perils of inbreeding. As the dust settled over his tomb in El Escorial, the ripples of his passing and the grotesque details of his physical ruin continued to reverberate through the courts, universities, and villages of Europe. Charles's story was not just a footnote in the annals of history. It was a turning point, a cautionary tale that would influence scientific thought, political alliances, and cultural memory for generations to come. His legacy, though steeped in sorrow, carried lessons that refused to be forgotten. In the immediate years following Charles's death, the political landscape of Europe was irrevocably altered. His decision to name Philip of Anjou as his heir, a choice made in the fog of his final agonies, ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that raged from 1701 to 1714. This war, pitting the Bourbon-backed forces of France and Spain against a coalition led by Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic, was fought over the very empire Charles had struggled to hold together. The Treaty of Utrecht, which eventually concluded the conflict, fragmented Spain's vast territories, with significant losses to Britain and Austria, signaling the definitive decline of Spanish dominance. Charles's death, and the vacuum it created, had reshaped the balance of power, proving that the frailty of one man's body could alter the destiny of nations. The autopsy findings, though not a direct cause of the war, became a symbol of Habsburg decay, wielded by propagandists on all sides to justify their claims or denigrate their enemies. On a scientific and cultural level, Charles II's life and the revelations of his autopsy began to shift perspectives on royal marriages and heredity. While the concept of genetics was still centuries away, the grotesque abnormalities detailed in the autopsy report sheet's malformed organs, atrophied reproductive system, and neurological damage prompted early discussions among physicians and scholars about the dangers of consanguinity. In an era where royal alliances were often sealed through close familial unions, Charles's condition served as a stark warning, though it would take decades for such practices to wane. His nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched, lingered in popular imagination, a blend of superstition and pity that painted him as a victim of forces beyond his control, whether divine, demonic, or simply the cruel lottery of birth. In Spain, his memory was a complex one-part mourning for a king who suffered so deeply, part relief that the Habsburg line, with its fatal flaws, had ended, making way for the Bourbons, who promised renewal even at the cost of war. Over time, Charles II's story was both remembered and deliberately obscured. Historians of the 18th and 19th centuries often glossed over the personal tragedy of his life, focusing instead on the geopolitical consequences of his reign's end. Yet, in medical history, he became a case study, a poignant example of the consequences of inbreeding when genetics finally emerged as a field of study. Modern analyses suggest that Charles suffered from a combination of rare genetic disorders, possibly including Klinefelter syndrome and pituitary issues, compounded by the cumulative effects of a severely limited gene pool. His life, once a source of gossip and horror, became a somber lesson in biology, a reminder of the human cost behind the glittering facades of monarchy. In popular culture, he remains a figure of fascination. His distorted portraits and tragic tale-inspiring novels, documentaries, and debates about the ethics of power and lineage. As we reflect on the life and death of Charles II, a question lingers like a shadow over history. At what cost do we pursue power, and who pays the price for the ambitions of the mighty? His body, dissected and laid bare, revealed not just the frailties of one man, but the flaws of a system that valued blood over humanity, legacy over life. His suffering, hidden behind palace walls until that final shocking autopsy, forces us to confront the darker side of history, where glory is often built on silent pain. Perhaps Charles's true legacy is not in the wars fought over his throne, but in the mirror he holds up to USA Mirror that asks how far we are willing to go to preserve what we believe is ours. If this story has stirred something in you, share your thoughts or questions below. What do you think history teaches us through the tragedy of a king like Charles II? Let's keep this conversation alive, for in remembering the past, we shape the future.